In the last section of the course, we talked about how you can use if statements and while loops in order to determine the flow of your code to make it differ from just running top to bottom. And in this section of the course, we're actually going to look at another way that you can change the flow of your code, and that's by using asynchronous code. This is something you've actually already done without even realizing it. For example, the set timeout function and the add event listener function both are asynchronous. And let's take a look at that real quick. So we just have an empty HTML file here, and we have this script.js file loaded with defer, and here's the script.js file. And over on the right, we have the console of our actual application. So let's just, inside of the script here, run a set timeout. We can say set timeout. We know that this is going to take a function just like this. Inside of this set timeout, what we're going to do is just console.log out high. And then let's say we want to do this after 1 second. I'm going to save the code right now. And then 1 second later, you can see the text high appears over here. And this is essentially the definition of asynchronous code. We created this function, but we didn't run it right away. We continued to run the rest of our application. For example, out here I could print outside, and here I could print inside. And if I save, you'll see outside gets printed, and then a second later, inside gets printed, because set timeout is running this function that we define inside of here 1 second later, based on this delay we specify. And so other code, such as this console.log outside, is actually being run first because it's running top to bottom, setting up this asynchronous function to run later, and then running outside, and then eventually a second later, this code gets ran. That is the idea of asynchronous code. Asynchronous code is essentially code in your application that doesn't run right away because it gets run at a later time or point, or maybe it even runs multiple times in a row, but later, such as an event listener. So if we add a button here, in this button, we're just going to put the text click me, and then we can select that button by just saying const button equals document.querySelector button. And now we can say button.add event listener, and we can say, for example, on click, we want to run some function that just console.logs clicked. And now if I just bring this down a little ways, bring this over, you can see that we have this button, and when we click on it, and if we inspect our page, you can see that it prints out clicked, and we can click as many times as we want. And if I just move this up here and move this down to the bottom, you can see as I click it, it's just going to increment that click because it's just logging click over and over and over again. And this is again asynchronous code because we're executing top to bottom. We execute our timeout, and this function inside the timeout doesn't run until later because it waits until this second finishes. Then here we get our button, we add an event listener to the button, and the code inside of here, this function, doesn't run until we actually trigger the event listener by clicking on the button itself. And then this code down here just runs normally, which is why you see it being printed first, because it's not asynchronous. It is synchronous, which means it runs in the order it's defined. These types of asynchronous code are what you're going to hear referred to as callbacks. A callback is essentially a function that you pass to another function in order to be executed at a later time based on some specific condition, whether it executes after a specific amount of time, whether it executes, when an event occurs, or whether it executes based on some other outside thing, such as getting data from a URL or a database or some other means. It's just code that you run later based on some other criteria, and it's a function you pass to another function. So let's create our own function that is going to be a callback. We're just going to define a function that will run whenever we click on whatever we pass to it. We're going to create a function called click event listener. We're going to say add click event listener. And this is going to take in an element, in our case, a button, and it's going to take in a callback. This is going to be that function that we pass. And inside of this function, all we want to do is take our element, we're going to add an event listener to it, or click, since this is an add click event listener function. And then we're going to pass in this callback function. Because as you remember, every event listener takes a function, and this callback is a function. This would be the exact same as if we wrote an arrow function here, and then called callback inside of here. Both of these are doing the exact same thing. We're just passing the reference to our callback function here so that it can actually run the function itself whenever this event occurs. And if we come up here, delete this code, and instead of saying button.add event listener on click, what we do is say add click event listener, and we pass it our button as well as our function here, we will get the exact same results. So if I save this and click on the button, you see it prints out click down here. So we created our very own function, which takes another function as an argument, which in our case is this callback, and it's going to run some code and execute this callback at a certain point in time, in our case, when we click on a button. And that's really all there is to callbacks. Callbacks are all over the JavaScript language. For example, event listeners have callbacks, set timeout, set interval. They're really core to the JavaScript language, but they're a bit cumbersome because as you add more and more callbacks, you enter something called callback hell, which is where you have callbacks inside of other callbacks inside of other callbacks. For example, up here, let's say we set a timeout, and after 1 second we want to log something, and then after another second we want to log something else. So we would create another set timeout with a function inside of it. We're going to say console.log inside 2. Let's just get rid of all this code down here. And we'll put a duration here. We're just going to do 100 milliseconds just so it executes a little quicker. And you can see it prints inside and then inside 2. And now you say, oh, well, we need another set timeout inside of this timeout to run another, 100 milliseconds later. So we come in here with another set timeout with a function inside of it that does console.log inside 3. And this one's going to be another 100 milliseconds later. Now you can see we get inside 1, 2, and 3 being printed out. But you'll notice our code becomes more and more indented as we go. This is what's called callback hell, where you have callbacks inside of callbacks, inside of callbacks, inside of callbacks, and your code becomes really hard to read. I mean, this is an absolute mess, very difficult to read, and everything's nested inside of each other. This is where JavaScript invented the idea of promises, which is what we're going to talk about in the next video, and this cleans up all of this callback hell code. I can't wait to see you in that next video.